Hello again. I hope your Sunday is going great. I'm going to go ahead and do video again for my submission, but if this is a problem, please let me know in the comments and I'll make sure to change it up with some writing. I just find this is a very easy way for me to kind of express what I'm thinking, my line of thinking, and how I would answer your questions that you're asking. So this week I went ahead and chose Arturo as my student to choose for this assignment. I chose him for a few different reasons. Just some refresher background. He's 13. He is talented, crazy talented with chess. So to me, it reminds me of he likes the design challenge, likes puzzling challenges, can think in different unique ways. He has cerebral palsy, so he has a wheelchair for mobility. So he has mobility restrictions mostly in his arms and legs, and he has little speech ability. So the reason why I chose Arturo is because I feel like it's important to talk about this type of visitor that we have that commonly actually comes from museums. And I've actually interacted with a few different visitors of museums that have been similar to Arturo's situation. So I decided to choose him today. So scenario-wise, I'm going to talk about two different scenarios. Obviously, I'm very excited to see that you included the local museum bit, so I'm definitely going to choose that as my first one. Just as a refresher, it is the one that's about the anniversary of the hospital. The museum is hoping to create an exhibit for to promote STEAM, which I find is very easy to incorporate assistive technology, high, low, and mid-tech for that. And it wants to include technology-enhanced presentation of artifacts. So I wanted to draw some of my past experience to kind of talk about how this would impact Arturo's visit. One thing that's definitely important for the exhibit design is the accessibility. I already kind of talked about Children's Museum for their open concept, so I did want to bring up James Monroe Museum as well. Yes, some of the rooms are not accessible by wheelchair. However, upon entrance and the main exhibit area right here is a big open accessible area that you can kind of go around to all the different portions of the museum and kind of interact with the different main exhibits that exist. So I like this open concept idea, and I think that's very important for the local museum to consider for visitors like Arturo who are coming through who maybe have mobility restrictions. So that's definitely something that I think is important to remember to include when they're incorporating their exhibit design. So I think this is important to remember for participation, because if he cannot access the different activities or the different technologies offered, then he can't actually interact with the exhibit at all. And this is something important to always consider. Just like for a lesson plan, when you think of differentiation for students for a museum, you're going to think about differentiation for visitors. So the first one I wanted to talk about for differentiation for Arturo, this is something that's at NMOC. It was at my internship. I loved seeing the interaction with different visitors. It is the, excuse me, it's a interactive table that consists of different screens that visitors at their own pace can touch, drag, select things. I think this will be very interesting to have for Arturo if, for instance, they want to have some different, activities for him to select. They also have a wall version of it. This was on the third floor of NMOC. This isn't the exact one, but it's the same software. And this is where different visitors can click on artifacts or click on facts about the museum, look at them, turn them around. For instance, like this girl right here, this isn't once again NMOC, but they had something very similar where you can turn around artifacts, look at them in detail. This is all something that I feel like would be very good for Arturo to have an interaction with, because it's easy, it's at their own pace. I would like to see the museum possibly choose different levels. So the one at NMOC is pretty much at chess level, so anyone can really come up to it and interact with it. I did like the fact that the one they had on the wall, however, was more for anyone to come right up to it. There's no barrier, so I think that's something good to consider for the museum if they were creating their exhibit. This benefit for Arturo because he can go right up to the technology, still interact with the exhibit, look up close at it just like everyone at his own pace. There's no rush. And some challenges that might be coming with implementing the selected tool is it may be a bit pricey. However, a way that you can kind of change that is once again with the old-fashioned iPad. I don't have a picture of that, but it's definitely something that can be easily used. For instance, for this, at James Monroe Museum, actually they have some artifacts that you can zoom in on that kiosk I showed you in the past, and that's just a simple, like lower tech version, I guess, that they could offer at the exhibit if needed. Sorry, I'm just making sure I'm answering all your questions. Okay, so the second thing I would have for the museum for Arturo, to make sure that he has accessibility and also accessibility to the exhibit, but also interaction, would go ahead and be the joysticks. So these are actually my girls from my She Can STEM camp I helped with this past summer, and they did a lot of, so the museum obviously that you proposed did a lot of STEAM activities, and that's actually what my girls did. They worked right with STEAM. And I don't have pictures of this selected student, but we did have a student who had restrictions with cerebral palsy. So for instance, during this activity, when they were coding their little robot droids that you see right here, I'm not going to give names, but these drones right here, the student was unable to actually help build certain parts of it because of their mobility restrictions. So for instance, Arturo has mobility restrictions. However, because of their mobility restrictions, they were still able to interact with the joystick version of the activity right here, which this lovely girl's doing right here. These are also on the internet, so I can show you access to these pictures. However, the joysticks were a great version for her because it helped her be able to still interact with the activity. And I still think that's something that could be used for exhibits as well. For instance, if they have like an interaction part where students can choose different objects or answer different questions, Arturo could, if they have a joystick for Arturo, maybe it would come in handy for helping him select different options. So I think that's something good to consider, the different switches that we talked about in this reading. So talking obviously about, so for the museum, just to clarify, for my 2AT, I would choose different switches, keyboard alternatives, mouse alternatives, obviously for these. I would also offer switches. I couldn't find exhibits that had them, but there are exhibits that have switches as well, just even like on and off switches, buttons. So those are an alternative I would have, and also, of course, the touchscreen alternative that I showed you already, just to clarify. Also, just this other, sorry, I'm so excited to see this option. Another option would be maybe a floor like this. Anyone can actually really interact with this, wheelchair, stepping. So if maybe the museum wanted to have something interactive with the floor, a floor pad, this way, this is actually for math. Arturo could still access this with his wheelchair. It's flat, it's easy access, and it's just a different way, fun way that maybe if they had a game or something that Arturo could still participate in with the other students. And once again, I chose him because of the uniqueness of his activity. The next scenario I chose was the library, and right away it reminded me of the library branch. I would call it England Run. I think it's called Howell Library now. And so I chose that one because I think it's kind of also hand in hand with museums still because of the different options you can have. The Maker Lab is a great way to incorporate different students, and the Maker Lab at the Howell Library is actually, once again, accessible just like what Arturo would need. It's a very open space. I could not locate a picture of the Maker Lab itself, but it's a very open space. Tables are at kids' heights. There's a lot of open space for Arturo to get around, which I think is very important and accessible. So here it's talking about the different, he's going to be doing a report. So I chose, which these can be also used in museums too, is possibly a keyboard alternative for him. Once again, this actually was a software we use in museums. It was called Kuno iPad, I think, Kuno computer, and we did have, once again, that student who had the restrictions. So we have mobility restrictions with the keyboard. So actually this USB could be popped out and a different keyboard could be incorporated in. So maybe, for instance, if Arturo has some mobility restrictions and may need a larger computer for selection purposes, he could use a different type of keyboard. Once again, going back to the different mouse alternatives for the joysticks, maybe a joystick could be used for that software for 3D printing. I know 3D printing uses a lot of different software, so having that selection and being able to interact with, say, a keyboard or a different touchscreen keyboards, EDIC, are really important to help him still be able to choose his software and really choose which 3D printing option he'd like. And then going off of 3D printing, definitely think 3D printing is a good option for him too, just because if, for instance, he has mobility restrictions but is doing his project and still wants to interact with it, 3D printing after using that keyboard or mouse alternative AT, 3D printing is a great way to do so. Belmont Museum does this where they actually print some of the artifacts for different individuals to interact with the artifact, and I feel like this is a different way that Arturo could interact with different parts of his project. Just like, you know, I know he has mobility restrictions, but he still does chess, so still giving him that mobility access and also working with the different software that he'll be using. So they both go hand in hand, but I think it's important to remember to just give options, to have that ability to have that open access that's so important for Arturo, to have that equal access, to have different, say, keyboard alternatives, joystick alternatives, mouse alternatives, selection alternatives, with the touchscreen and the on-screen, and making sure they're at a height that's accessible to all individuals that come in. Because this sit-in's great, but there's only this part right here that is, for instance, accessible for handicapped, first person, individuals who have mobility restrictions. And I know, once again, you were asking if there may be any issues with all these alternatives, and I think it's important to remember, if there's any challenges, that there's ways to have low-tech versions of this. So for instance, for the joysticks, once again, for mouse alternatives, switches are a cheap and easy way to help with that. For selection, for instance, for interactives within museums, iPads can be used. I think the keyboards, I think the keyboards are different options. There's so many different overlays. So if one option, for instance, a large keyboard doesn't work, there's different options. I think there's really a lot, and especially with, this is coding if you can't see. If, for instance, a keyboard doesn't work and however he still wants to do coding, because Steam is both incorporated in the library scenario and the museum scenario, he can use coding, and it's just a drag screen version of it. So I feel like all of these really, there's different options to really make this happen so that Arturo still feels like he is involved, he has access, and he's still getting the same experience that the students are. And I feel like this is something that should be always highly considered by museum exhibit creators, and also by, for instance, the Maker Lab and everything like that. And I think the different examples I've given have done a really good job with that. Thank you so much for listening to me. Once again, get way too excited about museums. I hope I am giving a good balance of what you need. Once again, let me know if I'm doing an okay job with incorporating AT and museums. I'm really enjoying this class, and I'm doing a lot of research actually. So I really appreciate this. I hope you have a great night, and I hope to hear from you on Module 6.